Good afternoon, and welcome to the Magnus. I'm Professor Ben Brenner of Music, but the Faculty Director of Jewish Studies, and it is a pleasure to see all of you here for this really important discussion, and we're so grateful to the Magnus, and particularly to the Faculty Director, Professor Paula Fass, for enabling us to move what would have been a very sardine-like situation into a comfortable setting. So I want to invite Professor Fass to continue with the introductions and moderation panel.
So it's also my pleasure to welcome you to the Magnus and to this event, a panel on anti-Semitism, hatred, old and new. As Ben told you, my name is Paula Fass, and I'm a newly installed director of the Magnus here. I would like to welcome especially Deputy Consul General of Israel, Matan Zamir. Would you stand, please? He's joining us this afternoon, starting a 4-year stint as the Deputy General Director. It would have been nice if I could have introduced you to this panel by saying that this is a panel, we're going to spend 2 hours discussing history, reflecting on past events and phenomena, and trying to do a kind of analytic autopsy. What happened, when, where, and why. Unfortunately, we all know that that is not the case. We're here this evening, and we've moved to this enlarged space because we are aware that anti-Semitism is not just the subject of history. The recent reemergence of anti-Semitism, or better, the kind of unembarrassed resurfacing, is in fact the occasion for the formation of this panel and of the wider project of which it is part. And I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about this wider project, because it's really very significant. Both the Center of Jewish Studies, the Institute for Jewish Law and Israeli Studies, and the Magnus and the larger Berkeley community, starting with the Chancellor on down, and including the Chancellor's Advisory Council on Jewish Life and Campus Culture, have marshaled themselves to present a series of events, including lectures and panels, of which this is the inaugural panel. And they've commissioned and designed specific teaching modules, and even a film that will be prepared for the Golden Bear orientation of 2020. These are very important, and they're aimed at staff and students, and yes, even faculty, in order for us all to better understand and confront this social scourge, which seems at times to lie hidden, incubated like a plague virus, only to resurface to strike and kill. And it is an awareness of these matters that's brought you here this afternoon, brought me out of a very comfortable retirement, and then brought together this distinguished group of scholars. Before I turn the conversation over to them, whom you've really come to hear, I want to take a moment for just to say something quite personal. Despite the fact that I was born in a displaced persons camp after the Shoah in Hanover, Germany, I was shocked by the new tremors of anti-Semitic expression and behavior. My parents would not have been shocked. My grandparents, had they survived the Lodz ghetto and Auschwitz, would not have been surprised. But my reaction is a measure of how unprepared we sometimes are and how easy it is to forget. So we are here today to remember, to understand, and to take the measure of what anti-Semitism is and has been, and to take action. I will introduce the members of the panel at once so that the flow of their discussions doesn't get interrupted by my specific introductions. So first, John Ephron, the Horrick Professor of Jewish History at Berkeley. He specializes in the cultural and social history of German Jewry, with special emphasis on German Jews attempting to reinvent Jewish culture as they confronted modernity. Among his important publications are Defenders of the Race, Jewish Doctors and Race Science in Fin de Siècle Europe, Medicine and German Jews, a major work called The Jews, A History, and his wonderful study, most recently, German Jewry and the Allure of the Sephardic. Next to him, Ethan Katz, Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies, specializes in the history of France and the Francophone world. His research interests include Jewish-Muslim relations, Jews in colonial societies, Holocaust studies, and the interplay between religion and the secular in modern Jewish life. His first book was The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France. He has co-edited 3 volumes, including Secularism in Question, Jews and Judaism in Modern Times, Colonialism and the Jews, and most recently, Judophobia and Islamophobia in France before and after Charlie Hebdo and Hyper Caché. Robert Braun is Assistant Professor of Sociology and of Jewish Studies. With a recent PhD from Cornell, his research focuses on Jewish-Christian relationships in the early 20th century. His first book, Protectors of Pluralism, tries to explain why some local communities stepped up to protect Jews during the Holocaust, while others did not. His current book, Bloodlines, traces the roots of anti-Semitism in interwar Europe by studying the geographical spread of xenophobic themes in children's stories. Ronit Stahl is Assistant Professor of History and Faculty Affiliate in Jewish Studies. She is a historian of modern America whose work focuses on pluralism in the United States. She is the author of Enlisting Faith, How the Military Chaplaincy Shaped Religion and State in Modern America. Her current project, Troubling Conscience, Religious Freedom and Healthcare in Modern America, explores the tensions between pluralism and religious freedom through the history of religious hospitals. As is obvious, these 4 extraordinarily well-qualified scholars should be able to give us a sense of the range and tenacity of the phenomenon that has startled me and others into a much more intense focus on anti-Semitism in the world today.
Good evening. It's customary when one goes somewhere to give a talk to say what a pleasure it is to be here. It's a pleasure to see you here. I wish I didn't have to be here, and I'm sure you feel the same way about the topic. But nonetheless, this is where we are. By a variety of measures, social acceptance, economic well-being, and educational attainments, to name but 3, few periods in history have been as good for the Jews as the current one. Yet despite this, we are currently in a period of anti-Semitic resurgence. Since the turn of the 21st century, anti-Semitism has risen to levels not seen since the Second World War. And while its intensity bears little resemblance to that which occurred then, understanding the impact and nature of contemporary anti-Semitism will be sorely compromised if it is only measured against that which was perpetrated by the Nazis and their accomplices. Writing a few years ago in The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg noted, in 2014, Jews in Europe were murdered, raped, beaten, stalked, chased, harassed, spat on, and insulted for being Jewish. The situation in Europe has led many to rashly opine that the situation today resembles that of Europe in the 1930s. That, I believe, is a gross misunderstanding both of the past and of the present. The greatest difference, a regel achat, on one leg, is to say that there is not one government in Europe seeking to introduce anti-Semitic laws or sponsor violence against Jews. That said, the situation has only gotten worse since 2014. In France, Jews have been subjected to horrifying violence, including kidnapping, torture, and murder. By and large, the violence has a grassroots origin, largely perpetrated by Arab youth. In other parts of Europe, anti-Semitism has become part of the prevailing left-wing political culture. That is the case in Sweden and in England. In Hungary, it is the country's right-wing political culture that draws deep from the well of Hungarian anti-Semitism. Then, of course, there is the situation in the United States. Now, until the election of Donald Trump, American Jewry principal concerns when there were roundtable discussions and conferences and talks was about the situation in Europe. That has obviously changed. Now, in the first 10 days after the November election of 2016, the Southern Poverty Law Center recorded 100 anti-Semitic incidents, about 12% of all the recorded hate crimes. And the same center said that in 2016 there were 917 hate groups in the United States. Now, tellingly, the Southern Poverty Law Center categorizes groups by type, such as anti-immigrant, anti-LGBT, and anti-Muslim. There is, however, no category for anti-Semitic groups. In response to a reporter's question as to why this was the case, Mark Potok, who was a former fellow at the SPLC, said, "The reason we don't have a separate category for anti-Jewish groups is that the vast majority of them are all anti-Semitic." In this way, the current explosion of American anti-Semitism doesn't resemble what happened in Europe in the 1930s, but what occurred in the late 19th century, with the advent of anti-Semitism as a modern political ideology and worldview. In 19th century Central Europe, in particular, but not only there, a vast array of clubs, societies, and organizations with very different and even seemingly innocuous agendas were united by their anti-Semitism. These included hiking societies, ski clubs, Boy Scouts, stamp and coin clubs, nudist clubs, vegetarian societies, clubs dedicated to the promotion, believe it or not, of whole grain breads, sun worship societies, occult groups, colonialist organizations, and university fraternities. While their main mission was not always overtly anti-Semitic, anti-Semitism was central to their self-understanding and went far beyond merely denying membership to Jews. Similarly today, the overwhelming majority of hate groups place Jews at the center of their grievances and hold Jews responsible for everything they detest about the world. So even when their focus is on things like immigration from Latin America, HIAS is to blame, affirmative action, civil rights, LGBTQ rights, this issue of religious freedom, that's the fault of the Jewish-dominated ACLU. Multiculturalism, that is blamed on the Frankfurt School. Globalization and job losses blamed on Wall Street, a euphemism for Jews. And Trump's closing ad is a perfect example of that. The Jews in all of these places, in all of these groups, are front and center. But almost no attention has been paid to this in the media, which understandably, but far too narrowly, tends to focus on the groups overtly mentioned by the purveyors of hate. This attribution of broad, indeed limitless power to Jews is particular to and a product of the modern world. Now let me compare it briefly with anti-Semitism in its pre-modern form, which functioned as follows. The Jews were branded as deicides, cast aside by God because of their rejection of Jesus. An official church policy as articulated by Pope Gregory I around the year 600 proclaimed that for their sins the Jews were to be punished, humiliated, despised, and discriminated against. And so over the course of the Middle Ages, a vast rap sheet of wild accusations was made manifestly true via a veritable archive of texts, visual arts, sermons, songs, folk tales, rhymes, ditties, and children's games, whereby the church taught Christians to hate Jews and taught them that it was morally the right thing to do. But as menacing as the Jews may have been seen to have been, Christian Europe considered itself all-powerful, all-conquering, indeed invincible. The Jews, by contrast, weak and hated by God, were a source of moral contagion, but they could never bring down Christendom. Modern anti-Semitism, by contrast, beginning in the 18th century, is radically different from the medieval variant, even as it absorbed and transmuted medieval attitudes towards Jews. It differs in two ways, conceptually and organisationally. In terms of the former, conceptually, whereas no medieval could ever really contemplate the Jews as anything but weak, the central concept of modern anti-Semitism is that the Jews are all-powerful, ready and willing to conquer the nation-state and indeed the world. Organisationally, modern anti-Semitism is defined by the term politics. The birth of modern anti-Semitism is coterminous with the rise of modern politics, and by the 19th century in Europe, political parties were formed whose entire raison d'etre was to stop the Jews conquering the world. Because of the belief in Jewish omnipotence, anti-Semitism is unlike any other form of prejudice, at least in the West. Where misogynists see women as inferior and racists see people of colour as inferior, anti-Semites see Jews as superior, using their brains for cunning, criminality and conspiracy. Their belief in and pathological fear of Jewish superiority stem from the way Jews integrated into modern European and American society. The wildly disproportionate presence of Jews in every field of endeavour in so short a period of time after being emancipated suggested something unnatural at work. I can talk more about that later in our discussion, but as such, anti-Semites there banged out a consistent drumbeat that said German culture had been verjudet, meaning Jewified. And this claim of Verjudung, or Jewification, is the immediate origin of the chant heard at Charlottesville, that the Jews will not replace us. The anti-Semitism that pre-existed but was emboldened by Trump's campaign and election comes from the extreme right. But there has also been a rising tide of left-wing anti-Semitism whose charges and iconographies are sometimes strikingly similar to those used by the right, even as its social base is very different. There are two principal drivers of this phenomenon. One is race and the other one is Israel. The first derives from the underlying character of America's own history of racism. The twin pillars upon which that history and legacy rest are skin colour and underrepresentation. Indeed, skin colour and underrepresentation have historically gone hand in hand in the United States. As such, it is only reasonable that an American understanding of racism is seen through that lens. The problem is that while this is appropriate for peoples of colour in the United States, it is not a universally applicable framework to understand other forms of prejudice, particularly anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is neither predicated on skin colour in a normative sense, something again I can speak about later, nor on underrepresentation, but rather overrepresentation. On the left, over the last few years at least, there's been a tendency to not see or take seriously the reality of anti-Semitism because of the assumption that racial prejudice is something that only people of colour can suffer, and that overrepresentation, dubbed frequently as white privilege by the left, is some sort of shield against hatred. However, as history makes clear, whiteness did not protect the Jews in Europe before and during the Holocaust, and it doesn't protect them from violence today in either Europe or the United States. And that is because while most people would consider the majority of American Jews to be white, absolutely no white nationalist would consider them to be white. They're very explicit about this, and sometimes murderously so. Another source of today's anti-Semitism derives from a virulent hatred of the State of Israel, and it must be stated, of course, that there's a difference between criticism of Israel's policies and behaviour and anti-Semitism. In no way is all such criticism anti-Semitic, and if it were, of course, 50% of Israeli Jews would have to be branded as anti-Semites. However, there are instances when there is no distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and I will conclude by just pointing out four ways this manifests itself. First, when the anti-Israel right and left use identical language and iconography. Just in one example, Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, used to refer to the American government by the initials ZOG, which he called the Zionist-occupied government. Something you will hear about the left and the control of Israel and the Congress of that Middle East policy. Second, when criticism of Israel exists in a near total vacuum to the exclusion of any reference to the outrages committed by other state actors. Third, when Israel's actions are described as typically Jewish, which necessitates the invocation of a host of anti-Semitic stereotypes, such as cruelty, immorality, bloodlust, thievery, and a sense of chosenness. And fourth, hostility to Israel can be anti-Semitic without it being deliberately so, insofar as it can be unconscious, emerging from what the British philosopher Bernard Harrison has called the climate of opinion. It is something, he says, that is formed out of a multitude of spoken and written items. Harrison goes on to say that when enough people in a given social circle have bought into a given climate of opinion, that climate of opinion becomes dominant in that circle. As I see it, these are some of the most important features of anti-Semitism of the past and today, and hopefully by identifying them, we can shape the contours of future and further discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to sort of add another set of layers to that wonderfully kaleidoscopic view of the subject that John Efron just gave us. And those really are around the question of colonialism and the colonial dimension of anti-Semitism historically, the way that anti-Semitism and colonialism have been knitted together in really important ways, I would argue, to both the past and the present. I'm going to discuss briefly three major points. The first is the paradoxical historical relationship between colonialism and anti-Semitism. Secondly, the emergence of a counter-tradition of shared activists among opponents of anti-Semitism and colonial racism. And finally, I'll discuss briefly at the end the amnesia about these histories and how it affects our politics today. So the rise of mass politics and race thinking that John spoke a little bit about coincided importantly with the rise of European colonial empires. In the late 19th century, Britain, France, and other European powers who were touting democracy, equality, and notions of the public good were also conquering large swaths of the globe. And large numbers of Europeans were settling many territories and expropriating land, gaining social control, and monopolizing local politics. Now, in order to square this circle, right, this contradiction between democratic values on the mainland and empire overseas, they had to undertake a series of measures, and there are three that are particularly important for our story. One is the creation of racial hierarchies that would defend the superiority of European civilization and the inferiority or otherness of the native peoples. Second, the practices of divide and rule that pitted some segments of colonial society against others. And finally, a rhetoric of emancipation in many cases, particularly the French case, that spoke constantly of an eventual equality for native peoples, but that always remained on the horizon, so that these peoples were, in the memorable phrase of one scholar, always in the waiting room of history, not actually arriving at emancipation. Now, one of the largest colonial empires in the world, that of France, exemplified these practices and their impact upon Jews, particularly in French North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, which by the mid-20th century was home to some 500,000 Jews, and where Jews lived for many decades alongside another population that was subjected to intense colonial racism, Muslims. In French Algeria in particular, Jews found themselves frequently pitted against Muslims by French policies. Jews were granted citizenship en masse in 1870 for a variety of complicated historical reasons that I'm happy to talk about in the discussion. At the same time, the promise of assimilation was just that for Muslim fellow inhabitants, the vast majority of natives there. It was invoked rhetorically, but it was absent from real life, and instead there were actually a whole series of legal penalties for very petty crimes understood as the natives code in Algeria. And here we come to the paradoxical relationship of anti-Semitism and colonialism. Many racial anti-Semites saw Jews and Muslims as racially linked, fellow Semites, both racial others with much in common, but also that there was the ever-present danger of fratricidal conflict between the two groups. And at the same time, a number of important French writers of this time created a stock character, the Jewish colonial conspirator who was blamed for imperial overreach and its threatening backwash to the mainland. And so the fallout from this 1870 act, the so-called Crémieux decree that granted Jews equal citizenship in Algeria, reflected these contradictory modes of anti-Semitism in the colonial context. The Emancipation Decree for Jews in French Algeria was pushed through by the French Minister of Justice, Adolphe Crémieux, an important Jew, very devoted to the Republic. And the response to this was in part to blame this decree for a revolt that broke out the next year that clearly had nothing to do with it, that was led by a series of Muslim sheiks. This was the notion that Muslim-Jewish conflict was endemic, so this fratricidal violence. The same concept was also there in the constant opposition of French colonists to the emancipation of Jews that lasted for decades. And the thinking was, if one non-Christian, non-white so-called group could become emancipated and equal, then very easily the entire population, the much larger Muslim majority, could do so, which would entirely upend the racial hierarchies and the structural inequalities that made colonial rule possible. At the same time, Crémieux was treated as the embodiment of the Jewish colonial conspirator. He was alleged to have worked only for the sake of his fellow Jews, at the expense of France during the Franco-Prussian War, in careful coordination with other Jews, and basically to have carried out this treacherous act as part of a colonial conspiracy that was only in the interests of Jews. And in France's North Africa, about Jewish imperial power. Colonialism was really important for anti-Semitism because it knitted together, through these two constructs, a number of the key ideas that could have otherwise seemed contradictory. In the colonial schema, Jews were racially inferior and economically powerful, conspiring in international concert and acting as political puppeteers over the nation's interests. And this would remain the case through the 1930s. Now, jumping way forward in time to the aftermath of the Holocaust, we see that this rhetoric linking colonialism and anti-Semitism found its mirror image in the emergence of a counter-tradition of resistance, where Jews and other oppressed groups locked arms against the colonial powers and their exclusionary aims. The most striking case was a man named Albert Memmi, who was a Tunisian-born French Jew, who wrote one of the most important treatises against colonialism called The Colonizer and the Colonized, published in 1957. And then he went on to write a whole series of essays and books about other groups facing oppression: blacks, Jews, women, the poor. And he eventually wrote an entire book called Dominated Man in 1968, where he tried to put these together. And he compared them, but he also pointed to certain structural mechanisms and systems of thought that linked multiple types of oppression. In hindsight, we can see clearly that this was a pioneering form of analysis that would really be called today intersectionality. The great difference between Memmi's early work, however, and today's conversation on intersectionality, and I'll say another word about this in a minute, was that Jews were front and center for him. Memmi explained this clearly in his 1966 book, The Liberation of the Jew, where he laid out his view of the Jewish condition. Quote, "The Jew was and basically remains an oppressed person, the object of constant potential threat anywhere in the world. Like all oppressed people, they have the right to a specific liberation. The liberation of peoples, Jews included, has assumed the form of national and social liberation. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, and the state of Israel is the culmination of Zionism. All other courses of action are ultimately nothing but accommodations with oppression." Now, this view may sound strange to our ears, but it was at the time hardly exclusive to Memmi. There were a whole series of post-war thinkers, Hannah Arendt, Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, Jean-Paul Sartre, who saw the Jewish question as fundamentally linked to the condition of other oppressed peoples. Fanon, who was a famous anti-colonial theorist from the French Caribbean, he wrote in one of his classic works, Black Skin, White Masks, about a conversation that he has in Martinique, far away from the Holocaust, with his teacher, who says, whenever you hear anyone abuse the Jews, pay attention, because he's talking about you. Fanon wrote, later I realized that he meant, quite simply, an anti-Semite is inevitably anti-Negro. While hiding out in Cairo in the early stages of the Algerian revolt, Ahmed Ben Bella, future president of Algeria, was carrying around constantly a book of the writings of Menachem Begin. And he would tell people that Begin was his Bible, that Israel was a civilization of the avant-garde and a model for the future Algerian state. Now, this counter-tradition is essentially no more. And I would argue that its collapse has led us to forget not only that Jews struggled together for decades against oppression alongside other marginalized groups, but that Jewish history fundamentally is a history conditioned by anti-Semitism. And this double erasure essentializes and distorts images of Jews today. When anti-Semites today claim that Zionism simply is colonialism, they return us to the image of the Jewish colonialist that I have mentioned, and forget the complex history of Jews in colonial spaces. I would contend that it is in part through such forgetting that persecuted Jews fleeing Europe for Palestine become equated somehow with Dutch Afrikaners who settled South Africa. The same historical amnesia helps to shape untenable yet widespread assumptions about Jews today as simply white and privileged that John spoke about. Likewise, when Jewish activists in France or the UK or the US conclude that the fight for minority rights or religious tolerance or protections for immigrants is no longer a fight that concerns Jews, they obscure from view the intersectional nature of anti-Semitism, colonialism, and other exclusionary ideologies like Islamophobia and anti-black racism. In sum, it's essential that we recall a history where anti-Semitism and colonialism were fundamentally linked, and a counter-tradition of resistance in which Jews saw themselves and were seen as fighting alongside other groups with histories of oppression and marginalization. For non-Jews seeking to combat hate today, and for Jews themselves, recovering these interconnections is imperative both to understanding the present and to finding a way forward. Thank you.
Technology works, and that's not a good start. Let's see. No, I think I should be good. What I'm more worried about right now is the projector getting caught on. Oh, you turned itself off.
It's turning on.
Okay. Well, that gives me the opportunity to say that I am both honored and a little bit intimidated to be part of this panel and be in front of you right now. What I would like to do today is two things. First of all, I would like to talk for a little bit about a research project that I'm working on right now, and that is very related to today's discussion. And then I would like to see whether the findings in this research project can somehow shed light on how we think about anti-Semitism today and how we should investigate it further. So I'm currently working on a research project on a phenomenon called Kinderschreck, as the Germans call it. If you would translate this into the English, it would probably be something like children's fright or children's shock. Allow me to sort of briefly explain to you what this phenomenon is. It's an oral tradition deployed by parents to discipline their children in certain types of behavior. Let me give you a brief example. Growing up in the Netherlands myself, my parents, when I would play outside, would not want me to move too far away from the house. Therefore, they told me a story about the guy with the bow tie, who was living 2 blocks from my house. And if I would pass that street, it would not end well. The guy with the bow tie would throw me in the well. Okay. Now let us not underestimate the impact that that story had on my life. When I walk, not so much in Berkeley's campus, but some other campuses around this country, I see someone with a bow tie. I'm like, oh my God. I already scanned this room to make sure that there's no bow ties here. And rest assured, we are safe. All joking aside, however, the boogeyman in these simple tales is not always the guy with the bow tie. Sometimes it's an animal, sometimes it's a monster, sometimes it's a woman, like here, an example from Trieste, and sometimes it's the wandering Jew. Okay. So what I've been doing over the last 2 years is I have been culling archives of folklorists and tried to mark where and when Jewish boogeymen show up in these Kinderschreck stories. You see it mapped right here, where each light gray dot denotes a town where there was no Jewish boogeyman showing up, according to the folklorists, and each green dot denotes a town where a boogeyman did show up. Okay. When you look at these data, and I've done this in more detail than you can do right now, there's two important things that you need to notice. First of all, the presence of these stories, it not necessarily coincides with the presence of Jews. Apparently, Jewish fear can exist without there being Jews in your immediate surrounding. The second thing that you need to notice is that Jewish fear clusters in space. It happens all over Germany, but there are also certain clusters that you can discern. And you can see that a little bit clearer in a map right here that shows percentages of towns in certain counties that have a Jewish boogeyman. Now what you can see here is that there's sort of a borderline pattern visible in these stories. You see the top north, the border with Denmark. You see Ostfriesland, the border with the Netherlands. You see the border adjacent to the Twente region. Of course, the border with France and Belgium. Then a little bit with Switzerland. It almost skips Austria, and then it shows up the border with the Czech Republic and Poland. Now, how is it possible that this clustering takes place? I think there's many causes, but I would like to highlight two in particular in light of our debate today. First of all, borders. And at this point in time in human history, and I forgot to mention actually, which I will do right now, which is a little bit hokey, but anyways, that I'm looking at Weimar Germany between 1920 and 1932. Okay. And at this point in time in German history, borders were a focal point for nationalist mobilization. Germany had just lost territory in World War I. And as a result, people started mobilizing around these borders as being sort of, important elements of the nation. Proximity to the other, so proximity to the Poles, proximity to the Danes, proximity to the Dutch, also meant national and ethnic boundaries much more visible. And who was the one who threatens those borders and boundaries the most? It was the wandering Jew that we know from the Kinderschreck story. Another dimension that I would like to highlight is that these regions were also home to very strong regionalist movement. So this is a picture from the Landvolkbewegung, a regionalist movement active in Schleswig-Holstein, in the border with Denmark. And what this movement did is it sort of criticized the central authorities in Germany, the central urban elites of the Weimar Republic, for selling out their country to international interests. Okay. And who came to symbolize these international interests and these urban elites? It was again this Jewish imagined transcendent actor. So that brings us more or less to the situation we are in right now. I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence that we are seeing sort of a rise of anti-Semitism, at the same time that we're also seeing a rise of national and ethnic boundaries being activated, and that we're also see a rise of a movement that tries to distance itself from the ruling elites in the coastal cities and try to mobilize around those types of ideas. Now, that for me raises a very important question. I think it's an important question. And that question is anti-Semitism only about relationships between Gentiles and Jews? Or is it also about relationships within the Gentile community in and of itself? Is it when cleavages within Gentile communities start emerging and appearing and becoming more prominent that Jews are the first one or maybe not the first one, but one of the ones that get to suffer. And that sort of course, also has consequences for how we study anti-Semitism and how we experience anti-Semitism. So maybe we are here at a Jewish studies event, and that's great. But maybe we should also try to think about forging linkages between communities that study these other ethnic threats. And here I'm partly echoing Ethan's point made earlier, sort of these study centers that focus on other types of fault lines that get activated within the Gentile community, African American studies, Latino studies, etc., etc. I hope, and I think that Berkeley has an important role to play in that project, and I would like to thank you for your time.
Thank you. I'm going to now turn to the American context, pick up on some of the threads mentioned by my colleagues earlier, and I think hopefully expand them in some ways as well. Last spring, after the synagogue shooting in Poway, California, American Jewish novelist Dara Horn wrote in the New York Times, "I don't know what to tell my children." Many who responded to her focused on the children. This is perhaps not unsurprising. What does one say to young people 6 months after a different shooter massacred 11 Jews simply because they went to shul to pray on a Saturday morning in Pittsburgh? What do you say to the next generation about guns, about attacks on synagogues, about hatred of Jews and its violent incarnation? How do you talk to kids about anti-Semitism? Horn didn't know. She couldn't resolve this in her essay, and uneasily concluded by repeating, "I don't know what to tell my children about this horror." Yet I think the conversation with children is actually not the hard part. It might be uncomfortable and hard to do, because talking about synagogue shootings honestly and openly in language kids can understand comes with a certain amount of difficulty. But it's necessary and important work. So with apologies to Horn, whose novels I quite like, focusing on children is, I think, a bit of a dodge. The hard part is not about specific incidents, as searing as they are and as hard as they are to digest, because that's an act of telling. The significantly harder act is explaining. And that hard part, therefore, is talking about ideas and ideologies, about patterns and power. The hard part is explaining how a community that by the end of the 20th century felt safe, comfortable, and secure, indeed enmeshed in the United States, no longer feels as safe, comfortable, and secure. The hard part in this sense is interpretive. It's that analytic autopsy Paula Fass mentioned earlier. The hard part is figuring out how to recognize, discuss, explain, and grapple with the recent eruption of American anti-Semitism. The lethal forms enacted by synagogue shooters in Pittsburgh and Poway, the linguistic forms uttered in accusations of disloyalty by the president and by others, the cultural forms unleashed via memes and manifestos on the web, the social forms embodied in khaki and polo shirt clad, swastika flag carrying and torch bearing marchers in Charlottesville, the visual forms disseminated by cartoonists and embedded in campaign ads, the profane forms manifest in the desecration of Jewish cemeteries, the graphic forms staged in spray paint on walls and sidewalks, the defamatory forms hurled in insults and insinuations of Jewish plots to control the world. All of these are present in the United States today. Some of them represent the resurfacing of age-old tropes about Jewish conspiracies and long-standing efforts to eradicate Jewish communities. But some of them are newer, fed by the internet and by the ascendance of white power movements in the United States. And this interpretive and explanatory work is hard, in part because this resurfacing of anti-Semitism is part of a broader revival of white nationalism in which Jews are a, but not the only target, and indeed, national law enforcement has, if somewhat reluctantly, acknowledged that white supremacy is the leading terrorist threat in the United States today. It's hard, too, because the existing historical narratives about American Jews, whether written by professional historians or promulgated by community leaders, don't fully explain the situation of American Jews in 2019. How is it, and I echo here some of John Efron's comments, how is it that an economically stable, politically incorporated, socially integrated, and religiously multifaceted community has become so deeply concerned about its own physical safety and security? If, and I'm painting in very broad strokes here, communal narratives often focus on the experience of American Jews as a tale of overcoming trauma. It might be the recalcitrance of Peter Stuyvesant in the 17th century, social exclusion in the 18th and 19th centuries, immigration restrictions, and communist witch hunts in the 20th century. That's one way of telling the story of American Jews, that they've overcome these obstacles and traumatic experiences to emerge a strong and healthy community. Another version is the version often narrated by professional historians who tend to focus on this trajectory of upward mobility through the lens of internal community discord. Disagreements between Sephardic and Ashkenazic leaders in the 17th and 18th centuries, conflict between the elite German Jews and poor immigrant Eastern European Jews in the 19th century, and competing communal, religious, demographic, and political impulses of the 20th century. In both of these cases, anti-Semitism can be overplayed or underplayed, often lingering in the shadows but not fully accounted for. And this helps explain why so many in the community, and I count myself in this group, as Paula mentioned earlier, were so unprepared for the events of recent years. Because what both of these narratives, which at times may seem oppositional, is this a narrative of a triumphant community or of a plotting, difficult to reconcile, internally disconnected community, what both of these narratives miss is the ways in which American anti-Semitism was quietly institutionalized and still, therefore, needs to be dismantled. What do I mean by this? If we go back to the 1910s and cross the country to Atlanta, a burgeoning city with a growing Jewish population, we can think through one instance of anti-Semitism and its aftermath. In 1913, Leo Frank, a Jewish manager of his family's pencil factory, was accused and convicted of murdering Mary Fagan, a young woman who worked at the factory. He was, by all accounts, the last person to see her alive, as she had stopped by to collect her wages, and eyewitness accounts placed the two of them together. Public pressure to convict a murderer was fervent, and the testimony of the facility's janitor sealed Frank's fate. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Despite numerous appeals to various courts that identified procedural legal problems and questioned the atmosphere of public hostility, Frank found few allies. The Jewish community tried in some cases to intervene, but there didn't seem to be anyone to help. Yet when presented with the case, Georgia's governor took the concerns seriously, a move that might not be expected for a Southern governor. At the time, he reviewed all the testimony and visited the site of the murder, and he decided Frank was innocent and decided to commute his sentence. But the story doesn't end there. The concerned citizens of Atlanta, outraged by what they saw as a miscarriage of justice, lynched Leo Frank, who had also been attacked in prison by another prisoner. In addition to the violent murder of Frank, those same outraged citizens also fed the flames of anti-Semitism, arguing that Jewish money and Jewish power had undermined the entire criminal justice system. It would take 7 decades before Frank was pardoned. The Frank case also while the Frank case highlights the lethality of anti-Semitism in America, it also gives us material with which to historically think through both the outcome and the context. As a result of Frank's appeals to Jews to help him, he was a member of B'nai B'rith and requested aid from brothers in the fraternal organization. The Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, emerged to combat anti-Semitism on an organizational level. The ADL has a history in politics of its own, one that takes a number of twists and turns. But for our purposes today, it's important to recognize 2 elements of the organization. It emerged directly from an acute incident of anti-Semitism, And second, over the past century, it has been the most dedicated collector of data about anti-Semitism in the United States and globally. But at the same time, and out of the same moment in the same city, another organization was forming, the Second Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. The avowedly white supremacist organization would coalesce around terrorizing those who did not fit their vision of a white America. Jews, African Americans, and Catholics were their most hated enemies. And it is this organization, like the white citizens' councils of the 1950s, which arose to combat the growing civil rights movement, that has cultivated a form of institutional anti-Semitism. It is this anti-Semitism that led in the 1950s and 60s to a surge of synagogue bombings. Notably, the Temple, a Reformed shul in Atlanta, was targeted because its leader, Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, was very involved in the Atlanta civil rights movement, attacking synagogues for their political involvement, as we also saw in Pittsburgh, where the shooter lambasted the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society's work in the immediate hours before the shooting, is yet another example of this. But these attacks are the most visible forms of anti-Semitism. And as I mentioned earlier, there are quite a few other forms of anti-Semitism. These visible forms, these violent forms, are somewhat easily attributed to individual or personal grievances. But they are born of institutional anti-Semitism, of organizations that foment hate. And these organizations, much like the list that John Efron mentioned earlier, are not necessarily dedicated overtly to anti-Semitism like the KKK. There are other institutions that still have anti-Semitism at their core. And this is different, and I can speak more about this later, than what I would see as structural anti-Semitism or structural racism in the United States, which codifies anti-Semitism or other racism into law. Instead, in institutional anti-Semitism, it can be any type of group. It doesn't have to be sanctioned by the state. It can be the KKK, it can be certain churches, it can be the modern Republican Party, it can be hate groups. As we know recently, the Twitter algorithms can't distinguish between the latter two. And these forms are dangerous because they're not always so obvious. It's in these spaces that anti-Semitism becomes a mode of analysis, a type of self-understanding, an explanatory device, and at other times, an incendiary device. And thus, we need histories of American Jews that attend not only to the obvious moments of anti-Semitism, be it discrimination, bigotry, vandalism, or physical violence. We also need histories that think about the ways that even Jewish organizations that are dedicated to combating hate have not fully contended with the vast tentacles of hate deep in the core of American institutions. And until we grapple with this, we can't effectively explain or fully combat anti-Semitism in America.
We've gotten a lot of extraordinary descriptions and analyses here. I'd like to start off the conversation with the audience with a question. And that is, each of you has given us different explanations and different contexts for this almost the same thing. So if I were so inclined, I could take a tragic view of this and argue that there's always something lying under there, which will find the Jew as
well, I would give sort of a couple of responses. One is that just as anti-Semitism is not new and has recurred, so has the fight against anti-Semitism, right? The surprise that anti-Semitism brings for American Jewry and much of American society in part reflects a consensus that was forged not easily over an extended period of time, where most social anti-Semitism was relegated to the margins, and wherein, and this would be this is my second point, there were a series of alliances between Jews and other groups to fight against anti-Semitism. And I think that there is currently, as I alluded to in my presentation, that there are various alliances that leave Jews out right now in terms of the fight against hatred. But I don't think that it's inevitable that that continue. And I think that efforts like our own and those that are being undertaken in many communities to bring this issue to the forefront have the capacity to make people across a wider spectrum realize that for groups like the KKK, anti-Semitism is absolutely essential. It's not one more thing on a list, right? And I think that if we're able to persuade people that anti-Jewish racism is a threat to everyone, and I think historically it's pretty indisputable, and there's a lot of evidence for it today, then I think we have the capacity to rally the kind of broad coalition that we need to really fight this more effectively.
I take a similar view to you, but I'm an older generation and from a very different place. So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, I grew up in Melbourne, as some of you know, but in a community almost entirely of Polish Holocaust survivors. And that is shaped by, you know, among other things, view of the world. One of the things that's gone to shape my view of the world. And so I can tell you one of the things that when I was back in Melbourne, I talked to my mother every day, and one of the things that shocked Jews in Australia was the shock of American Jewry at being killed. They couldn't believe that they were so shocked. Now, I live in a community that's not waiting for that to happen. We don't have guns in Australia, and it doesn't have a history of anti-Semitism like the United States. But what they brought with them psychologically, that legacy from Europe.
John?
Yeah. The legacy that they brought with, that's better, I'm sorry. The legacy that they brought with them from Europe is one that sort of leaves Jews on guard. And they basically saw American Jewry as having dropped its guard and were shocked at the shock. So I'm also less optimistic, well, you know this anyway, just by being my colleague down the hall. I'm less optimistic than you about the forging of alliances. Alliances are shattered at the moment. Ronit didn't mention it, but I mean, one only needs to look at the Women's March, the Dyke March. You know, this stuff happens on the left as well, where there's a shattering of alliances. One, of course, can't make alliances on the right, and the left, which was sort of a hope and had existed. It'll take some, I don't know the way forward to repair those alliances, but that came as a tremendous shock as well to those people who were rejected from those marches and from those organizations. So I'm sorry, there's not going to be a happy American ending here, but from my perspective, but maybe you want to speak to Robert, who's also not from here.
I'm also not from here, and I'm also not going to be telling a story of hope, but more a story of tragedy. And this sort of links back to other work that I've done, the book that I've just published, which is on the protection of Jews and sheltering of Jews during the Holocaust. So one of the sort of key elements or key findings of the book is that it's often other minorities and other persecuted groups that develop empathy and develop sympathy for those who are in danger. They can sort of see that they might be next in line and therefore step up. The problem, of course, is that those who are marginalized themselves, those who are the minorities, those who know what persecution is like, are often not the ones that can have the most impact on a society, because otherwise they wouldn't be marginalized to begin with. So no story of hope, but more story of tragedy. I'm very sorry about that.
Okay, I'll be the optimistic American for a moment. I think we're in a tough place, but I think we're in a place where there are opportunities if people are willing to do the work. And I think actually the Women's March is a good example in that there is anti-Semitism on the left, but I actually think it is of a significantly different kind than on the right and isn't institutionally lodged, as I talked about. And so one thing with the Women's March is actually over the summer, almost their entire leadership has changed. And it was in part an effort to draw more Jews in and to bring in people who are willing to have hard conversations with one another. And hard conversations that the boundaries of which may be uncomfortable for everyone involved, how to navigate sort of Palestinian solidarity as well as work through American anti-Semitism. But a willingness to engage in sometimes uncomfortable conversations is essential. And I don't think the end goal has to be complete sort of overlap in goals, in the way in which communities work, but there has to be a willingness to work together and to talk these things out and to then change actions. And I think what we see on the left is, I think it was your last point in your talk, John, about sort of the climate of opinion, that sometimes, I actually think the anti-Semitism on the left in the United States is not always of that sort of unconscious sort, but often is, such that what we see is people a willingness to call it out, and then there has to be that willingness to think through, to actually work through it, and to recognize it, and to move past it. It doesn't always work, but we have a few examples of that happening, such that I think building on that movement, building on a willingness to have uncomfortable conversations, and building on efforts at solidarity. We can look to the Muslim community who did a tremendous amount of fundraising around the desecration of Jewish cemeteries. We can look at alliances around immigration. We can look at spaces where there are active alliances and use them to build. I don't think it's an easy path forward, but I do think there are possibilities.
I'm sorry.
There's actually a mic going around. Ben?
Sorry, I don't want to be challenging, but I'm going to be. Because our lives are at stake and our children's future is at stake, I believe. And our children's lives and our future are at stake. End of subject, period. We cannot pussyfoot around anymore. We cannot be silent. We cannot be under conditional acceptance. That has been the rule of law as a Jew in the United States. We accept that our holidays are not acknowledged. Our kids are penalized for that effort, as I was penalized in graduate school. Our high schoolers are penalized. Our kids are kicked out for challenging it, that they may wear a different hat than a Christmas hat in this day 3 years ago in our communities not far. No, I absolutely think that the left has maybe room for potential, but I'm going to disagree wholeheartedly. I've followed this for about 4 years now, and I would say that there is an outrage that should be happening by the minority community joining us in allyship, and where that is that they have hijacked the Black people and POC community efforts and used the Palestinian wedge issue to take all of the energy away from all the people that need to be heard at the table. And the Women's March has replaced those leaders that left, like Linda Sarsour, who's now working on Bernie's campaign, and other people, and has replaced them with similar people. So we need to be vigilant, and we need to speak out, and we need to create allyship, and we need to say no. The Black community, the POC communities, and some of us who are POC, we are not Eastern European, not a drop of Eastern European blood here. I want to just say that we have to build allies, and we must not let it go by. We cannot be kicked out of progressive movements. We've got to be vigilant.
just wanted to say, this isn't really a question, but kind of in response to your point, I think it's true that a lot of us are feeling very afraid right now. We're feeling that we're at a lot of risk. And that's very justified, but I think it's important, talking about what you were saying about finding a path forward, that we not retreat into fear and paralysis and hatred of other people, which I think is definitely a possibility. So let's just be mindful of that.
I have a question related to where we are now, and particularly I'll say I was brought up in a little Jewish town in an Irish neighborhood where it was the world of being a Christ killer. I confronted a woman who was virulently anti-Semitic where I was working and showed her and read the Second Vatican Council on elimination of perfidious Jews and so on, and she looked at me and she said, I don't give a damn, Jews are still Christ killers. And I wanted to ask about Jewish relationship to Catholics here now, and also relation to Baptists, because of the anti-Semitism task force I am at my synagogue, which is in Danville. The rabbis, they won't even speak to Baptists. And I lived in Arkansas and Texas, and my experience was, that's an awful mistake. That's not the same anti-Semitism that I experienced as a youth. So I really would like to ask about where we are now, not something that we've heard so much about, the Women's March and left-wing anti-Semitism, but where we are now, particularly in relationship to those two extremely significant groups.
So, it is on. Yeah, I would like to briefly respond to the earlier challenge, which I actually think is less of a challenge than it actually is, because it sounds that you say that we should no longer ignore this, we should be doing something, we should be building these coalitions. I think that that sounds very much like the way I think about it and the way that Ronit talked about this. So maybe it is a challenge, but maybe less of a challenge than you think it is. I think there's more agreement there. So regarding religion, I think the question about, so what about relationships with Lutherans, and what about relationships with Baptists and Catholics? I think sort of asking a question like that is a little bit tricky. I think you need to think a little bit more refined about what local conditions and national conditions shape, how they shape these different religious communities at different places. So I would like to give an example. And again, I am not here from the United States, so I will give an example from Europe and from the history of World War II, because I think it's very insightful. If you were a Catholic in Belgium, or you were a Catholic in the dominantly Catholic provinces of the Netherlands, or you were a Catholic in some of the most Catholic parts in Germany, you were pretty likely to be anti-Semitic. If you were a Catholic, however, in the Protestant regions of the Netherlands, you were very likely to actually defend pluralism much more openly. And why do I sort of bring this up? I bring this up because I think what that shows us is that it's maybe not so much about religious communities, but it's about the underlying social relationships and how these groups relate to the state. Now, the Irish example is rather interesting and very complicated, because we know that the Irish, not only the Irish Catholics in the United States have not only been, at times, anti-Semitic, they've also been rather racist in general. And in very much what you see, if you look at sort of Irish history, Irish immigrants in the United States, is that often they try to sort of belong to the white group, and in order to do that, try to distance themselves from all the communities that they did not consider white. So again, the reason why I bring this up is because it also shows that what's driving the anti-Semitism of religious groups is not so much their religion or their ethnicity, it's their position within local networks and their position within a state. That would be my response to this.
I'll just say one thing in response or in partial agreement with Ronnie, and that is there is a difference between the anti-Semitism on the left and the anti-Semitism on the right. There's no question about that. The anti-Semites on the right are the ones that have AR-15s and automatic weapons. And as a result of the Holocaust, the bar for anti-Semitism is very, very high, and violence is the bar. So that's far more important, right? But similarly, at the same time, you know, I don't want to be defined by either group. I don't want the right to tell me that I'm not white. I don't want the left to dismiss me as a white guy, which has now become a pejorative term that is perfectly legitimate to say in public. Privilege. Privilege, but just, oh, he's just a white guy, she's just white. I mean, this sort of dismissiveness, if you replace the word white with any other group, it would be an outrage. And that's one place that we can start to sort of change the language and perhaps the way we think about these things. But specifically, both of them are seeking to define Jews. Right? So on that score, there's a parity. But in terms of what they do to Jews, there is a difference, and the right are violent, and the left are less, at the moment, less so. And likely to remain that way. So that's my bit of optimism.
We have someone over here.
Schwach, I know, but you know.
Yeah, well, I can tell here that I having problem with actually the Jew here in America. They are all criticized, not all, some criticize Israel, against Israel politics, against that, but also what my biggest concern is in the university. We have many professors that are anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and now, just recently, I heard that they allow in Southern California in high school to teach Semitism, anti-Semitism.
Right.
So this is it's a big problem.
So there's no question that university campuses are a major site for concerns about these issues. I'm proud to say that we're pushing forward a very significant initiative now of anti-Semitism education on this campus. This is an inaugural event of a series of speakers this year, 6 different speaker events, but also we've created a module for training for students, staff, and faculty that we will continue to develop and that we'll continue to use both in multimedia trainings and in in-person trainings. And at the level of the state, there's been a lot of discussion about the ethnic studies curriculum that was initially developed in the state legislature. The good news is that the pushback, in significant part from the Legislative Jewish Caucus, has been very effective. And this, I think, is a good example of where there are some cases of effective alliances that have emerged, where other legislators have been shocked to sort of understand better what's in there, and also the concerns that Jews raise that they had not thought about. And it still is a process, but they've made enormous progress in terms of convincing people that that curriculum needs to be changed, and that fundamentally ethnic studies, which has historically not included Jews, which is strange and problematic in itself, that at the level of state education it should include Jews. So these are good things.
So I was raised in one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. I went to an Ivy League school, and then I came out. It's unbelievable. This didn't happen 30 years ago, but I find that it's happening now. And I use the word perplexed because I just don't understand why.
Okay. Just in response to that, I know that you thought you may have come to some kind of paradise and left wonderful New York behind. But let me tell you that at the moment, and you wouldn't know this from the mainstream media, you have to read the Jewish press, It is absolutely open season on religious Jews in New York City in terms of violent attacks. They happen on a near daily basis. So, again, unfortunately, and this is not to minimize what you said, I understand what you said, I recognize it, but unfortunately, for me, the bar is always violence. And that, you know, the meeting on the Saturday morning pales in comparison to the open attacks. So even in New York, where one would have least expected to see this happening, it is unfortunately alive and well. So it speaks to me, and Paul can speak to this as being a New Yorker. I mean, that it would happen there is really cause for deep concern, and for me, I'm sorry to say it again, some pessimism, because I really, that to me is shocking. I wasn't surprised about anywhere else, but New York City, I thought that would be a sanctuary, but it is turning out not to be the case.
I think this is actually a really helpful moment to distinguish in the American context between the legacy of what some call the Protestant moral establishment, the sort of the notion of the calendar, which does in many ways discriminate, right? Christmas is a federal holiday, Jews, Muslims, other groups have to take off for their holidays. Meetings on Saturday mornings are just not a big deal for 98% or more of the American population. And these are artifacts of a certain type of dominance that has to do with assumptions, and assumptions about the rituals of the week and the rituals and the yearly calendar and other facets. But that, I think, as frustrating as it is something that actually can be combated with education. That there is, like, that's actually something that, while systemic and aggravating, is fixable. And is fixable even in the short term, even if it takes, raising, attention about it. On the other hand, issues around violence are much harder to deal with. Though I would push in the sense of the issues in New York today, to me, are perhaps less, this is a case where I'm less surprised, in part because there's a history, particularly in the 1960s, the Ocean Hill-Brownsville, real clashes over schools and other instances in which there have been not just divisions, but real violence toward one another. And part of what that gets at is the additional layer, and I think Robert raised this in terms of local context, of understanding not just big sort of group divides, but actually on the ground understanding the local conditions that enable clashes to erupt beyond the verbal and move into the violent.
I have a question regarding, is there a catalyst that you can identify? If we accept the theory that there's always an underlying anti-Semitism in societies, what in the 21st century in the United States is causing incidences to be so much more? Is it the boldness of the far right? Is it different measurement? And is it electronic communication? Is it the success and strength of Israel and the effect that has on the Arab-Israeli, Arab-Palestinian Israeli conflict? What is there an identifiable, correlatable, since you're researchers, catalyst that we can point to, or is it all of the above, or did I miss something?
No, it was a good list. You hit most of the points. And plus, without any shadow of a doubt, the microphone. Yeah, that's coming. Without any shadow of a doubt. You have a president that has emboldened those groups on the right to come out of the woodwork. They were always there, and they have their own subculture, and it's to a great extent it's actually a global subculture. It's not just it takes particular forms in different countries, and this one, of course, the main difference between, you know, the far right here and the far right in Europe is not one of ideas, but it's the availability of guns. But I would add the encouragement that they've gotten from the president to your pretty comprehensive list.
I would like to ask a question regarding freedom of speech and hate speech. Coming from a country which is France, where hate speech is not allowed legally. There's a law since 1972. There's also a law in Britain. There are laws in France against the denial of the Holocaust. I'm not saying that we should approve these things, but I'm just saying that other countries do it differently. I also noticed that the ACLU recently has moved from defending mostly freedom of speech and paying much more attention to hate speech and saying that we should make exceptions in the freedom of speech regime. Do you think that changing or like working to change the law around freedom of speech and anti-Semitism and other forms of hate speech, would that be something that would be interesting to think about and work towards? Or is this something that cannot possibly ever work in a country like the United States?
I mean, it's a great question. I would basically register a great deal of skepticism toward legal solutions. There is a lot of debate, actually, as you may well know, about the efficacy of these laws in Europe. But more importantly, we're in a moment where free speech is used to defend all kinds of speech that is found to be deeply problematic and hateful. So politically speaking, efforts to penalize, criminalize that type of speech seem bound to provoke deep backlash and sympathy from those not necessarily sympathetic with the content of that speech. So it seems to me to not be a solution, unfortunately.
I'd like to have you address the issue of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. And this issue, even many Jews I know don't seem to make a distinction. They think anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, but it calls for the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. And it denies us the right to have a homeland and to be safe in a homeland. So the reason I'm pointing it out is because it is the new form of anti-Semitism. So Israel has become the Jew among nations, as Yossi Klein Halevi has written. And it's very dangerous because people like Linda Sarsour, for example, think that if she raises money for Jewish cemeteries, that she is not anti-Semitic, but she is definitely outspoken about Zionism being fascism. She sides with someone like Farrakhan. So therefore, she's trying to pull the wool over people's eyes to make it look like she's Miss Bernie Sanders. She's going to get the first Jewish president elected. At the same time, she denies the right of Israel to exist, calls it a colonialist entity, genocidal, apartheid, on and on. So you see, there's this big hoax going on that I don't think a lot of people on the left, including Jews on the left, really recognize to be the case. They're being subverted. So please comment on that.
I'll say a word. I mean, I think the question of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is a fundamental question in this conversation. And I think distinctions have to be carefully made. What we mean by anti-Zionism can mean many things. If we mean criticism of the state of Israel and its policies, then I think most reasonable people can agree that within certain boundaries, that's not anti-Semitism. If we mean attacks on the right of the Jewish state to exist as a sovereign nation, then we're in a completely different realm that I believe is fundamentally anti-Semitic. And so I think one of the goals in this education initiative is for people to learn about the core stereotypes historically against Jews. notions about conspiracy, notions about cabal, notions about money, that are frequently employed in anti-Israel rhetoric today, and frequently the place where that crosses over into anti-Semitism. And so I think that we have to educate the public, and we have to be able to articulate a reasonable set of kind of ground rules for these conversations that doesn't seem overly defensive about any criticism of Israel, but that draws a clear line about where that criticism clearly ventures into a different realm than legitimate political debate.
The microphone's over here.
I think
John.
I'd like to commend the panel for showing a number of instances where the roots of anti-Semitism can be expressed and developed in different social situations. But what especially interested me was one of these speakers pointed out that there are parts of Germany where there are no Jews, yet anti-Semitism is quite inherent, and which leads to a very serious problem, I think. Why are Jews targets? Because such convenient targets, and I think some of you have sort of hinted at that. We're been targets for essentially 2,000 years, beginning with the domination of early Christianity in the 4th, 5th centuries up to the present time, the apostles. And the apostles maybe started it, but it was the power of the Christian church, which essentially began anti-Semitic development and doctrines to isolate the Jews and to condemn them as convenient targets for all kinds of situations. And I think, somebody has to start putting some emphasis on dealing with this, changing this notion that Jews are a target, a religious target, a convenient religious target, a legitimate target, which can easily be used for all kinds of purposes. And I think some development, social development, is necessary there to deal with this issue.
John,
well, just about the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism question, I concur with much of what you said. The problem is that the anti-Israel stuff on the right, and I'll give you one exception in a minute, the anti-Israel stuff on the right, the anti-Semitic stuff on the right, if you accuse someone on the right of being an anti-Semite, they embrace that label. If you call someone on the left, contradictory to the larger cause that they are promoting. And that cause happens to be, in this particular case, Israel. And when it is Israel, I'm actually sick of just having to say, well, it's not all of it is anti-Semitic. We know that's a given. And until the war, let me just tell you, until the war, if I may be permitted to be a historian for a moment, go back to the past, it was a minority position in the Jewish world. Most Jews were not Zionists, and most Jews were not anti-Semites either, even the ones who didn't want a state. So that would include the ultra-Orthodox, it would include the Bundists, it would include those who were liberals, who just wanted to live in the countries that they lived in. It was not they were not desirous of a state, and for some they just thought it would never come to be, and only with the Holocaust did it become the majority position among the Jews. So we know that most Jews are not anti-Semitic, and most Jews up until the Shoah didn't support the state. So there's clearly a distinction here. But the question is when the question turns for me on the expression anti-Israel. I don't hear someone being anti-Bulgarian. I don't hear anyone saying that Bulgaria shouldn't exist. So it's not about being opposed to the policies. If someone is anti-Israel, I take that literally. I'm opposed to the existence of the state. That's what that person is saying. Now, the fact of the matter is, I didn't want to get into an Israel thing here, but you know, we're long past who started it. This is like, you know, two kids, two siblings, you know, who started the fight. We're long past that. The issue is that you have 7 million Jews there, right? 7 million Jews. If the state doesn't exist, what are you going to do with that 7 million? One genocide per people is too many, but a second is really over the line. And denying 7 million people of a place to live is really a call for another genocide. And that's just utterly unacceptable. So we have to be sort of mindful of legitimate criticism. And as I said during my remarks, you know, half of the country voted today for policies that were different from that of the governing of the government. They're not anti-Semites. They criticise the government. They're not anti-Semites. But there are plenty who do, and Linda Sarsour is absolutely one of them, and Bernie Sanders is being a useful idiot.
Let's thank this wonderful panel. And before you leave, I want to remind you that we are just the inaugural event in a long series. You have some information on flyers about the next events that are going to take place, and the most immediate one coming up will feature Robert Braun on October 17th, and I hope you'll join us then, and come bring more of your wonderful questions. Thanks to the audience.